Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Jeremy Reed and I'll be your teacher for this course, Philosophy 301, Ancient Philosophy. Now, ancient philosophy is a huge subfield. There are any number of things that we could have talked about, but for this course, I've chosen to focus on one topic, namely ancient moral psychology. Well, there are a few elements to it. Ancient philosophy generally is about the figures in the Mediterranean from the period of about 500 BCE to about 400 AD. So that's a 900-year chunk. That's pretty big, and obviously we can't cover everything in that period. So what we're going to do is focus on two particularly important schools of philosophy. The first is that of Plato, and the second is that of the Stoics. So that's who we're going to be reading and the context that we're working in. But what's moral psychology? Well, in general, moral psychology is the branch of philosophy that seeks to understand and evaluate the rational and affective parts of our moral agency. Well, what does that mean? The basic thought is most people act for reasons, but we also experience a bunch of emotions that seem to be relevant to our moral experience. When people act morally well or morally badly, not only do they think a certain way, but they also feel certain things. We think that there's something wrong with someone who, for example, gives a lot of money to charity but does it begrudgingly or only so that they can get a tax return. We think that a good person is someone who gives money to charitably and is in a willing spirit and someone who's glad to help. So already we're seeing that the kinds of reasons that people act for and the kinds of feelings that they have are relevant for assessing their moral agency, namely, what kind of person they are. Yeah, that's right. But that's because the questions that philosophers who work in moral psychology are concerned with are actually a little bit different from the kinds of questions that you'll see from someone in a psychology department. For example, a psychologist might ask a question like this. They might say, what are the conditions under which human beings experience shame? So they're engaged in a descriptive project working out what kinds of things trigger shame in people and how it is that people in fact respond. But what philosophers want to ask is they don't want to ask an is question, they want to ask a should question. Philosophers who work in moral psychology want to know whether you should feel shame, and if so, under what circumstances. They're also interested in questions about whether or not shame helps you to act rationally. So because we're asking these questions about whether or not something is right, whether or not we should do something, and how those things are connected with rationality, that's just not mere description. For example, it might be, as the Stoics are going to claim, that although most people feel anger regularly, they shouldn't. Anger is bad. That's what the Stoics are going to claim. So because we're making evaluations about people's psychological states and how they're acting, it's a branch of philosophy rather than psychology. We're not just asking what people in fact do, we're asking how they should behave, how they should respond, and what kinds of mental states that they should have. And because we're asking those kinds of normative questions, this is a branch of philosophy rather than psychology. Empirical data is going to be relevant, but it can only help us so much in answering these questions. In particular, what we're going to do in the course is basically divide it up into 4 chunks. The first chunk is going to be on Plato's Republic, focusing on his theories of moral education and his theories of what's called the tripartite soul. What we're then going to do is look at his dialogue, the Phaedrus, in Unit 2, which focuses specifically on this question around what are the good kinds of love that we should have in our life, and how does sex figure into that as well. In the second half of the course, we'll focus on the Stoics. So what we're going to do in the first unit on the Stoics is look at their general theories of ethics and what they conceive of happiness as. They have some pretty bold views, and there's a lot of technical terminology, but a lot of people find the Stoics very rewarding, and I think you'll find it rewarding as well, especially if you're stuck at home during quarantine. In the last part of the course, we're going to look at some more contemporary critiques of Stoicism. The The Stoics famously claim that you should never get angry. There's no occasion on which it's appropriate to get angry, and experience a bunch of other emotions that people tend to experience a lot. So what we're going to do is look at how it is that some people have critiqued their views, and how it is that the Stoics might respond to some of those critiques. Now, one of the cool things about doing ancient philosophy is you're working with a civilization and a culture that's 2,500 years separated from our own. And one of the things I really like about ancient philosophy is seeing how it is that lots of the ideas which were important to these people are still relevant today and can still teach us a lot about how it is that we can live a good life and become better people. On the other hand, they are working in languages that are very different from our own, and so often the terms that you'll read in these books don't quite match on to how we talk now. So we have to be a little bit careful with some of the terminology. Now, I'll explain more of the important terminology as we're going through the course, but just to begin now, I think it's helpful to flag a few that always seem to trip up people when they first open the Republic and when they first hear discussions about it by philosophers. One of the most common terms you'll hear me use throughout this course in a slightly weird way is the term soul. Now, soul translates the Greek word psyche, which is where we get psyche and thus psychology from. So psychology is just the study of the soul. Now, soul can often conjure up some pretty weird things in the contemporary imagination. But for the ancient Greeks, your soul is just whatever it is that causes you to be alive. So for example, humans have souls, and animals have souls because they're alive. But plants also have souls. And what your soul does is it's responsible for your movement, it's responsible for causing you life. So insofar as the Greeks recognized that plants are able to move in order to get sun and in order to get nutrients, they must have a soul because they're moving of their own accord. Now, when we're talking about people and we're talking about a person's soul, often what that just refers to is your character. So if you're having trouble thinking about, what's all this discussion about someone's soul, just remember when you're talking about humans, your soul is just your character. It's who you are as a person, and it's what's responsible for causing you life. Now, of course, humans are a little bit more complicated than plants, and we do more than just live and move. Humans also, as we know, we reason, we experience emotions, we experience various kinds of drives towards objects like food and to drink, and we have interactions with other people. And all of this happens in a kind of mental space, and so what the soul does is the soul is what's responsible for all of those operations. Now, because the soul does all these things to do with beliefs and experience emotions and reasoning, some people think that you should translate psyche as mind. But you can see how it's a bit of a stretch given how many uses that soul gets put to. For example, think about hunger. When you're experiencing a desire for food, is that the kind of thing which happens in your mind? Or even more compellingly, again, think back to plants. Plants have souls, and insofar as plants are going for nutrients, they're said to have a soul and experience psychic operations. But does plants have a mind? That seems a bit of a stretch. So in that sense, we need a word which can kind of cover all of these things, and so soul just gets used as a placeholder for all of these operations. Virtue is a word that you will either come to love in this course or come to get entirely sick of, because I will go on and on and on about it. Virtue has sometimes archaic connotations in English. For example, if we talk about a woman's virtue, we mean something very particular. Now, we're not going to be using virtue in that context for this course. What virtue is, for the ancient Greeks, is an excellence of character. Namely, someone who is virtuous is someone who's a good person. So think about the person that you most aspire to be. Think about the people that you admire. If you think about how you describe them, you'll often use phrases like, they're really dedicated, they're really wise, they showed incredible courage, they showed great compassion and generosity. All of those things, courage, compassion, generosity, wisdom, all of those things are good character traits and are thus virtues. So virtues are those things that make you a good person, and the kinds of things that we should want to strive to be ourselves. The contrary of a virtue is a vice. Again, we tend to use vices in a rather mundane context and say things like, chocolate is my vice, I just can't resist it. But we're going to be using vice in a more serious way, namely to talk about bad character traits. So again, just think about the opposites of those traits that we just mentioned. Someone who's stingy is someone who lacks generosity, and so stinginess is a vice. Similarly, someone who lacks courage is going to be a coward of a certain kind. They're the kind of person who doesn't stand up for the things that they should. They can't face fear and danger even when there's a really worthwhile end. And so we say those people are cowards. Virtue and soul are the main terms that I wanted to focus on for now. But just a quick flag going forward, there are two others that sometimes trip people up, though I think less often. The first is the word emotion. Emotion translates the Greek word pathos, which in its most general term can just mean an experience. It sometimes seems that the Greeks are jumping around a lot when they talk about what an emotion is. And it doesn't mean that they're lumping a lot together conceptually. The Greek philosophers put a lot of effort into distinguishing different kinds of experiences and different kinds of emotions. But the actual word can be used in a lot of different senses. So just be aware that emotion has a very broad use in Greek philosophy. The other words that people sometimes get the wrong idea about are ethics and morality. Now, hopefully, if you've taken some other philosophy courses, you've seen that what we do in philosophical ethics is maybe not quite what you'd expect. But in ancient Greek ethics, they're asking questions that I think everybody kind of fundamentally cares about. And in that sense, everybody cares about ethics and the way that the Greeks think about it. And that's because Greek ethics starts from these questions about the kind of person you want to be and the kind of life that you want to live. Everybody has a conception of the kind of life that they want to live. Even if it's a bit fuzzy around the edges, most people have a rough idea of what happiness consists in and what a good life for them looks like. They also have rough ideas about the kind of person they want to be and the kinds of friends they want to have and the kinds of people they want to date and maybe one day marry. And so those are questions about character. If I asked you to list the qualities that you're looking for in a romantic partner, chances are you're going to give me a list of virtues. And what that means is that, again, everybody is kind of concerned with the way in which the ancient Greeks do ethics, because we're asking these really foundational questions about how we should live. So we're not going to get into questions about, for example, abortion or the ethics of when it might be permissible for a government to violate the citizens' rights. We're going to be taking a step back and asking kind of more general questions about the kind of person that you want to be and the kind of life that you want to live.